But you know what I realize now? When you say what's best for the whole family, you don't actually mean the whole family. You mean what's best for Sophie. You mean what's best for preserving the illusion that she's somehow special, somehow deserving of things that other people have to work for. Linda's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. That's not fair, Emma. You know how much we love you. You know how proud we are of your success. Do I? I asked, genuinely curious. Because I'm trying to remember a single time. When my success was celebrated the way Sophie's engagement was celebrated. I'm trying to remember a single conversation where you asked me about my dreams, my plans, my hopes for the future. I'm trying to remember when you last treated me like a daughter instead of a solution to your problems. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I watched my mother struggle with how to respond. This was new territory for both of us. Throughout my childhood and adult life, I'd been the accommodating one, the one who understood, the one who made allowances for other people's limitations and needs. I'd never confronted her directly about the disparities in how she treated her daughters. We've always known you were capable of taking care of yourself, she said finally. You've never needed the kind of support that Sophie needs. You've been independent since you were a teenager. And did it ever occur to you that maybe I was independent because I had to be? That maybe I learned to take care of myself because no one else was going to do it? I set the fountain pen down carefully, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the edge of the desk. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I would have liked to have parents who wanted to protect my dreams the way you protected Sophie's? Linda moved closer to the desk, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd used when I was a child, and she needed me to understand why I couldn't have something I wanted. Emma, sweetheart, we can work this out. The money's gone, yes, but we can find a way to make it right. Maybe we can refinance the restaurant, or take out a loan to repay the trust fund. We just need time to figure it out. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They'd managed to spend nearly $200,000 in 8 months on a single wedding, but now they were going to somehow find a way to repay it? The restaurant that had been losing money for years was suddenly going to generate enough profit to cover a debt that size? How long do you think that would take? I asked. How many years of struggling would it take for you to repay money that you stole from my future? And what happens in the meantime? What happens to my business expansion plans? What happens to the building I wanted to buy? What happens to all the opportunities I'll miss while I wait for you to maybe possibly find a way to undo what you've done? She didn't have an answer because we both knew there wasn't one. The money was gone, spent on flowers and photographs and imported linens that would be used for a single day, and then forgotten. There was no way to recover it, no way to undo the damage, no way to restore what had been taken. I need you to understand something, I continued, my voice steady and clear. This isn't just about the money. This is about trust. This is about the fundamental assumption that the people who claim to love you will act in your best interests, even when you're not watching. That assumption is gone now. It's been completely destroyed. I gathered the bank statements into a neat stack and slipped them into my purse. I'm going to go downstairs now and congratulate Sophie on her beautiful dress. I'm going to smile and nod and play my part in this family drama for a little while longer. But I want you to understand that everything has changed. Linda watched me move toward the door, her face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. What are you saying, Emma? What do you mean everything has changed? I paused in the doorway, looking back at the room where my grandmother had spent so many hours, where she'd taught me about integrity and hard work and the importance of building something that would last. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the furniture and making the space feel like a museum of memories that no longer belonged to the living. I'm saying that I'm done being the family's backup plan, I said simply. I'm done being the one who can always be counted on to understand and forgive and accommodate. I'm done pretending that what happened here today is something that can be fixed with explanations and promises. I could hear Sophie's laughter floating up from the living room, mixed with Brittany's voice as they debated some detail of the wedding reception. The sound felt distant now, like an echo from a life that I was no longer part of. "Enjoy Sophie's wedding," I said to my mother. "Enjoy every moment of it. Take lots of pictures. Make sure you get your money's worth." I walked down the hallway toward the stairs, leaving Linda standing alone in my grandmother's bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of better choices and the growing realization that she'd miscalculated badly. The wooden floor creaked softly under my feet, a sound that had been part of the background music of my childhood, but now felt like a countdown to something ending. 18 months later, I stood in the marble foyer of my new mansion in the West Hills, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as my parents' old sedan pulled into the circular driveway. The house was everything I'd dreamed of when I'd planned to use my trust fund for expansion, but now it represented something far more valuable than financial success. It represented the life I'd built entirely on my own terms. My company had not only survived without the trust fund money, it had thrived. The adversity had sharpened my focus, and I'd closed 3 major contracts that year, including one with a Fortune 500 company that had put Zenith Digital Solutions on the map nationally. The mansion wasn't just a home. It was a statement of independence that echoed through every room. Sophie's marriage had lasted exactly 11 months before Marcus discovered her shopping addiction and mounting credit card debt. The fairy tale wedding had been followed by a reality that no amount of imported flowers could fix. My parents had called me then, asking if I could help with Sophie's divorce lawyer fees. I'd politely declined. Now they stood at my front door, small and uncertain, taking in the scope of what I'd achieved without them. My father's eyes swept across the grand staircase, the crystal chandelier, the art collection I'd carefully curated. He leaned close to my mother, his voice barely audible but clear enough for me to hear. She never needed us at all. I smiled, finally understanding that he was right. I never had needed them. I'd just spent too many years thinking that I did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The money is gone, yes, but it went to something beautiful, something that will bring joy to our family for years to come. Sophie's wedding will be a memory we'll all treasure forever. Isn't that worth more than some abstract business investment? Before I could respond, the bedroom door burst open. Sophie stood in the doorway, still wearing her wedding dress, the elaborate beaded bodice catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with the particular kind of joy that comes from being the center of everyone's attention. "Mom, there you are! I've been looking everywhere for you. The seamstress needs to know about the hem length, and Brittany thinks we should add more crystals to the waistline. But I wanted to ask Emma first, since she has such good taste." She paused, seeming to notice the tension in the room for the first time. "What's wrong? Why do you both look so serious?" Linda and I looked at each other, and in that moment, I realized this was the test. This was the moment where I would discover whether my mother was capable of telling her golden child the truth, or whether she would continue the charade even now, even with the evidence of their betrayal spread across my grandmother's old desk. "Nothing's wrong, darling," Linda said smoothly, moving to Sophie's side and adjusting a wayward strand of hair that had escaped from her elaborate updo. "Emma and I were just discussing some family business. Nothing for you to worry about on your special day." Sophie's face lit up with relief, and she turned to me with the expectant smile of someone who had never doubted that the world would arrange itself for her convenience. "Emma, you have to come see the dress with the new alterations. It's absolutely perfect." I think I'm going to cry when I see myself in the mirror on the wedding day. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. The dress was stunning, clearly worth every penny of the $12,000 it had cost. Her happiness was genuine, infectious, the kind of pure joy that you couldn't fake or manufacture. But there was something else there too, something I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge before. Sophie had never once, in all the months of wedding planning, asked me about my business, my life, my dreams. She'd never inquired about whether I needed anything, whether I was struggling with anything, whether I had any concerns about my future. She'd been so wrapped up in her own fairy tale that she'd never even noticed the family members who were making it possible. "Sophie," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "do you know where the money for your wedding came from?" She laughed, a tinkling sound that reminded me of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, Emma, you know I don't worry about that boring stuff. Mom and Dad handled all the financial details. I just focused on making everything perfect and beautiful." She spun around, letting the dress flare out around her. "Isn't it amazing what they were able to do? I feel like a princess in a fairy tale." And there it was, the final piece of the puzzle. Sophie wasn't malicious or intentionally cruel. She was simply, completely, utterly selfish. She'd been raised to believe that her happiness was the family's primary concern, that her dreams and desires took precedence over everyone else's needs. She'd never questioned where the money came from because she'd never been taught to consider the cost of her choices to other people. My mother watched this exchange with satisfaction, clearly pleased that Sophie remained blissfully unaware of the source of her good fortune. This was how Linda had always managed the family dynamics, keeping each daughter in a separate bubble of information, ensuring that neither of us ever had the complete picture that might lead to uncomfortable questions or difficult conversations. "The dress is beautiful, Sophie," I said finally. "I'm sure your wedding will be everything you dreamed it would be." She beamed at me, interpreting my words as the approval she'd been seeking. "I'm so glad you think so. I was worried you might think it was too much, but Marcus says I deserve the best, and Mom agrees. She says this is my one chance to have the perfect wedding, so we shouldn't hold back." I nodded, understanding finally that this conversation was pointless. Sophie would never understand the cost of her perfect wedding because she'd never been taught to think in terms of cost and sacrifice. She'd been raised to believe that her desires were automatically justified, that other people's resources were naturally available to fulfill her dreams. The realization was liberating in its finality. I was done trying to make them understand. I was done hoping they would see me as something other than a resource to be tapped when needed. I was done being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to understand and forgive and accommodate. I stood up from my grandmother's rocking chair with deliberate slowness, smoothing down my blouse and taking a deep breath that seemed to fill my lungs with something cleaner than the air I'd been breathing for the past hour. The bank statements rustled softly as I gathered them into a neat pile, each page representing another piece of evidence that would never see the light of day if my mother had her way. "Sophie, could you give Mom and me a few more minutes to finish our conversation?" I asked, my voice carrying the kind of calm authority I'd learned to use in boardroom negotiations. "I promise I'll come downstairs shortly to see the final dress adjustments." Something in my tone must have registered with Sophie because her perpetual smile faltered slightly. She glanced between my mother and me, perhaps sensing undercurrents she'd never bothered to notice before. But the moment passed quickly, and her natural self-absorption reasserted itself. "Of course, I'll be in the living room with Brittany. We're going through the final seating chart anyway. Did you know Marcus's great-aunt has to sit at least 3 tables away from his grandmother because of some ancient family feud about a bridge game? Rich people have the most interesting problems." She laughed at her own observation and swept out of the room, the sound of her footsteps fading as she descended the stairs. The silence that followed felt different than before. Where there had been tension and accusation, now there was something cooler, more controlled. I could feel my mother watching me carefully, perhaps finally recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of our relationship. I walked to my grandmother's old writing desk, the one where she'd composed letters to business partners and family members in her careful, precise handwriting. The desk was exactly as she'd left it, with her fountain pen resting in its holder and a small stack of her personal stationery still waiting to be used. I picked up the pen, feeling its familiar weight in my hand. "Emma, I hope you're not planning to do anything rash," Linda said, her voice carrying a note of warning that she'd never used with me before. "This is a delicate situation that requires careful handling. We need to think about what's best for the whole family." I turned to face her, and I saw something flicker across her expression. It might have been recognition, or perhaps it was the first stirring of genuine concern. For the first time in our conversation, she seemed to understand that I wasn't going to simply accept her explanations and move on. "I've been thinking about what's best for the whole family for years," I said quietly. "I've been thinking about it every time I offered to help with the restaurant's marketing. I've been thinking about it every time I bit my tongue when Sophie changed majors again or dropped out of another job. I've been thinking about it every time I watched you stress about money while I had resources available to help." I paused, letting the words settle between us. She'd been talking about more than just business acumen. She'd been warning me about the family dynamics that would eventually lead to this moment. Sitting in her bedroom, discovering that the people who were supposed to protect my future had sold it to fund someone else's fairy tale. The trust fund had been substantial, nearly $200,000 that had grown from my grandmother's initial investment of $100,000 when I was 18. She'd structured it specifically to support my entrepreneurial ambitions, with detailed instructions about how the money should be used. Educational expenses, business investments, property purchases, emergency medical costs. Nowhere in those instructions had there been any mention of wedding expenses for family members. My parents had been named as secondary signatories with limited authority, meant to handle administrative tasks if I was traveling or unavailable. That authority was never intended to give them carte blanche to drain the account for their own purposes. But they'd found a loophole in the legal language, or perhaps they'd simply counted on my trust and assumed I'd never discover their betrayal until it was too late to matter. The wedding expenses were staggering in their excess. Sophie's dress alone had cost $12,000, custom-made by a designer who'd worked with minor celebrities. The venue rental was $50,000 for a single day, not including the additional costs for preferred catering, premium bar service, and exclusive access to the club's gardens for photography. The honeymoon package to Bali was another $15,000, booked at a resort that charged more per night than most people earned in a week. Every detail had been upgraded to the most expensive option available. The floral arrangements weren't just roses. They were imported peonies flown in from the Netherlands. The photography wasn't just professional. It was a team of 3 photographers, plus a videographer creating a documentary-style wedding film. The catering wasn't just dinner. It was a 7-course tasting menu paired with premium wines that cost more per bottle than I'd spent on groceries in a month during my startup years. As I sat in my grandmother's room, surrounded by the simple, elegant furnishings that reflected her practical nature, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Rose had lived comfortably but never ostentatiously, investing her money in experiences and relationships rather than material displays of wealth. She'd driven the same reliable sedan for 15 years, lived in the same modest house for 30 years, and found joy in small pleasures like her garden and her weekly bridge games with friends. Sophie's wedding represented everything my grandmother had taught me to avoid. It was consumption for the sake of appearance, expense for the sake of excess, Debt disguised as celebration. The money that was supposed to help me build something lasting had been converted into a single day of Instagram-worthy moments that would be forgotten within a year. The weight of the betrayal settled over me like a physical force. This wasn't just about the money, though the financial impact was devastating. This was about the fundamental trust that holds families together. The assumption that the people who claim to love you will protect your interests even when you're not watching. That trust was gone, shattered as completely as if it had been made of glass and hurled against a concrete wall. I heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by my mother's voice calling my name. Linda Chen had always been a small woman, but she'd possessed an outsized personality that filled whatever room she entered. Today, as she appeared in the doorway of my grandmother's bedroom, she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the guilty knowledge that I now shared. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing up here? Sophie's been asking for you. She wants your opinion on the final alterations." Her voice carried the same cheerful tone she'd used my entire life, the same assumption that I would drop whatever I was doing to participate in Sophie's latest drama. I held up the bank statement, watching her face change as she recognized what I'd discovered. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Her cheerful mask slipped away, replaced by the expression of someone who'd been caught in an act they knew was indefensible. "We can explain," she said, though her voice lacked any conviction. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. My mother stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Behind her, I could hear Sophie's voice drifting up from downstairs, still chattering excitedly about centerpieces and seating arrangements, blissfully unaware that her perfect wedding had been built on the ruins of my future. "Explain what?" "Exactly?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Explain how you systematically stole nearly $200,000 from my trust fund. Explain how you've been lying to me for 8 months while I watched you struggle with the restaurant, offering to help, never knowing you'd already helped yourselves to my inheritance." Linda stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. With a soft click, the gesture felt ominous, as if she was preparing for a conversation that needed to be contained, managed, spun into something more palatable than the truth. She moved to the window, her back to me, staring out at the garden where my grandmother had spent countless hours tending her roses. "Your father and I didn't want to burden you with the restaurant's problems," she began, her voice taking on the patient, reasonable tone she'd always used when explaining away life's disappointments. "You've been so focused on your business, so stressed with all your responsibilities. We thought it would be better if we handled the financial crisis quietly, without dragging you into our problems." The casual way she reframed theft as protection made my stomach turn. "So you decided to drag me into your problems by stealing my money instead? How exactly is that better?" She turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. It was a look of mild irritation, as if I was being unreasonably difficult about something that should be obvious. "Emma, that money was just sitting there, earning interest. You weren't using it for anything immediate." Sophie's wedding, on the other hand, was a crisis that needed immediate attention. A crisis? The word came out sharper than I'd intended. Sophie's wedding was a crisis? "You don't understand the pressure we've been under," Linda continued, moving closer to the rocking chair where I sat. "Do you know what it's like to have your daughter engaged to someone from the Thompson family? Marcus's parents are prominent members of the country club, successful business owners, pillars of the community. They have expectations, standards that need to be met. We couldn't let Sophie be embarrassed by a budget wedding that would reflect poorly on our family's status." I stared at her, searching for any sign of recognition that what she was saying was insane. The Thompson family owned a chain of mid-tier furniture stores, hardly the Portland elite she was making them out to be. But even if they had been royalty, the logic was breathtaking in its selfishness. So you decided that Sophie's social standing was more important than the inheritance Grandma Rose left specifically for me? Oh, Emma, she said, and now her voice carried a note of condescension that made my skin crawl. You act like this. Money defined your entire future. You're already successful. You have a thriving business, a beautiful apartment, more money than most people your age could dream of. Sophie needed this wedding to establish herself, to start her marriage on the right foot. You've never needed that kind of support. The statement hit me like a physical blow. In a single sentence, she dismissed every struggle I'd faced, every sacrifice I'd made, every sleepless night I'd spent building my business from nothing. According to her twisted logic, my success somehow disqualified me from accessing my own inheritance, while Sophie's lack of success entitled her to it. I worked for everything I have, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I worked 3 jobs to pay for college. I lived on ramen noodles and coffee for 2 years while I built my company. I never asked you for anything, never expected you to support me the way you've always supported Sophie. And now you're telling me that my independence, my self-reliance, somehow means I don't deserve what Grandma Rose left me. Linda's expression softened slightly, but it wasn't with understanding or remorse. It was with the kind of pity you might show a child who didn't understand why they couldn't have candy for dinner. Sweetheart, you're being dramatic. I'm Emma Chen. I'm 28 years old, and I was standing in my grandmother's old bedroom holding a bank statement that showed my trust fund had been completely emptied. Not reduced, not partially withdrawn, but completely drained down to $37.43. As I stared at those numbers, my hands trembling with disbelief, I could hear my sister Sophie downstairs squealing with excitement as she tried on her custom-made wedding dress for the 3rd time this week. A dress that cost more than most people's cars. A dress that I now realized had been paid for with my inheritance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday. I'd been sorting through my grandmother's personal effects, something I'd been putting off for months, since we'd finally decided to sell her house in the West Hills. Rose Chen had been more than just my grandmother. She'd been my mentor, my biggest supporter, and the one person in our family who truly understood my ambition. When she passed 5 years ago, she'd left me a substantial trust fund with specific instructions that it would become fully accessible when I turned 25. That money had been sitting there, growing, waiting for the right moment when I'd need it most. That moment had arrived 6 months ago when I'd found the perfect property for my business expansion. Zenith Digital Solutions had been thriving beyond my wildest dreams, and I'd been ready to take the next step. I'd been planning to use the trust fund as a down payment on a building that would house our new headquarters and serve as a testament to everything my grandmother had taught me about building something lasting. She'd always said that real wealth wasn't about the money you spent, but about the foundations you built for future generations. The bank statement had been tucked away in one of her old jewelry boxes, something I'd grabbed from her dresser without really thinking about it. I'd been looking for her jade bracelet, the one she'd promised would be mine someday, when I'd discovered the envelope marked Emma's future in her familiar handwriting. Inside was a complete record of every transaction made on the trust fund. A count over the past 8 months. Wire transfer after wire transfer, each one authorized by my parents who had been listed as secondary signatories until I turned 30. $50,000 to Riverside Country Club, $15,000 to Chen's Catering Services, $8,000 to Bloom and Blossom Florists. The list went on, each line item a knife twist in my stomach. Photography package, luxury honeymoon. Suite, designer invitations printed on handmade paper that cost more per sheet than most people spent on lunch. Every single expense traced back to Sophie's wedding. The elaborate affair that had been consuming our family's attention for the better part of a year. I sank onto my grandmother's old rocking chair, the same one where she used to read me stories about successful women who built empires from nothing. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was learning about my family's betrayal in this very spot, surrounded by the remnants of a woman who had valued integrity above all else. My grandmother had immigrated to America with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, building her import business one honest transaction at a time. She'd specifically structured the trust fund to protect it from exactly this kind of family manipulation, or so I'd thought. The sounds from downstairs grew louder. Sophie's voice carried up through the old house's thin walls, accompanied by our mother Linda's enthusiastic commentary, and what sounded like a small army of bridesmaids offering their opinions on dress alterations. They were discussing the reception menu, debating between the salmon and the prime rib, both options that I now knew had been paid for with money that was supposed to secure my future. The casual way they threw around numbers that represented my dreams made my chest tighten with a rage I'd never experienced before. I pulled out my phone and called my business partner Jake Rodriguez, my fingers shaking as I dialed his number. Jake had been my voice of reason throughout our entire partnership, the one person who could always see through the emotional fog to the practical reality of any situation. When he answered, I couldn't even form words at first. The silence stretched between us until he finally spoke. "Emma, what's wrong? You sound like you've seen a ghost." "They took it all, Jake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The trust fund, every single penny, for Sophie's wedding." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake knew how much that money meant to me, not just financially but emotionally. He'd been there when I'd first shared my grandmother's stories, when I'd explained how the trust fund represented more than just money. It represented her belief in me, her investment in my future, her way of ensuring that her granddaughter would never have to depend on anyone else for her success. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked, his voice careful and measured. "I'm holding the bank statements right now. 8 months of withdrawals. Every major wedding expense, plus some I didn't even know about." I paused, looking around the room that had once represented safety and unconditional love. "Jake, they didn't even ask me. They just took it." From downstairs, I heard Sophie's laughter echoing through the house, pure and joyful and completely oblivious to the devastation happening one floor above her. At that moment, listening to her celebrate a wedding that had been built on the foundation of my stolen dreams, I felt something inside me crystallize. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder and more resolute. It was the feeling of a door closing forever, of a relationship dying, of a trust being broken so completely that there would never be a way to repair it. That phone call with Jake lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of going through every document I could find, every email exchange with my parents about the trust fund, every conversation I could remember about Sophie's wedding plans. By the time I hung up, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across my grandmother's bedroom, and I had a complete picture of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. The trust fund hadn't been touched randomly or in a moment of desperation. This had been a calculated, methodical dismantling of my inheritance that had begun the moment Sophie announced her engagement to Marcus Thompson 8 months ago. The timing wasn't coincidental. My parents had waited until I was buried in the launch of my company's biggest expansion, knowing I wouldn't be paying close attention to accounts I wasn't planning to access for another few months. Jake had helped me piece together the timeline. The first withdrawal had happened 3 days after Sophie's engagement party, a lavish affair at the Riverside Country Club that I'd assumed my parents had somehow managed to afford. I'd been proud of them that night, watching them host such an elegant celebration, thinking they'd finally found their financial footing after years of struggling with their restaurant. Chen's Asian Fusion had been losing money for years, a victim of changing neighborhood demographics and my parents' stubborn refusal to adapt their business model to modern realities. I'd offered to help them with the restaurant multiple times, suggesting marketing strategies, digital presence improvements, menu updates that could attract younger customers. Each time they'd politely declined, insisting they wanted to keep the business authentic to their vision. What I hadn't realized was that they'd already found their solution to the restaurant's problems, and it was sitting in my trust fund account, growing interest while they planned how to spend it. The irony cut deep. For the past 5 years, I'd been the family's quiet success story. The daughter who'd graduated summa cum laude from Portland State, who'd built a thriving digital marketing agency from nothing, who'd never asked for financial help or emotional support. I'd been financially independent since college, working 3 jobs to pay for my education while Sophie floated through community college on our parents' dime, changing majors every semester as she searched for her passion. When Sophie dropped out to become a lifestyle influencer, our parents had been nothing but supportive. They'd helped her set up her photography equipment, driven her to networking events, even hired her to manage the restaurant's social media accounts at an inflated salary that bore no relationship to her actual contribution to the business. Meanwhile, I'd been building Zenith Digital Solutions in a cramped apartment, surviving on instant ramen and determination. My grandmother had seen the dynamic clearly. During our last conversation before she passed, she'd pulled me aside at a family dinner and expressed her concerns about how my parents treated their daughter so differently. Rose had built her import business during an era when women entrepreneurs were rare, and she'd faced discrimination and dismissal at every turn. She'd recognized the same pattern in my family's treatment of me and Sophie, though she'd been too diplomatic to say it directly. "Emma, darling," she'd said, her voice still strong despite her illness, "success isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the most prepared when opportunity arrives. You have something special, something that can't be taught or given as a gift. But you need to protect it, because not everyone will understand its value."